Welcome to Apologetics from the Attic, the show that seeks to teach and defend the Christian faith in a post-Christian culture. And now, broadcasting from an attic in an undisclosed location somewhere outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, here is your host, Dave Lewis. Hey, you doing, everyone? Welcome to another episode. In this episode, we're going to start a debate review of what else? The James White, Leighton Flowers, John 6:44 debate. Now, I'm telling you, I don't think there's been a debate online which had as much online. The debate wasn't done online; it was in person. But there hasn't been as many hours of review of this debate posted to YouTube than I've ever seen. So it's it's everywhere. I was actually, just a plug for this one, I was checking them out. Always good stuff. Turton Fan is the YouTube channel. Gets up on the screen. Conversations in Calvinism. Dan Chapa, Turton Fan, and then CJ Cox. This is, and then if you're watching, Dan Chapa did this. He sent it to me. He said I could use it. A shout out to Dan. He flowed the entire debate and he broke it down in this Excel spreadsheet, going through the verses. Now, what's interesting is it was kind of disjointed, the debate, and how it did flow. I think mainly because of Dr. Flowers. I agree with Dr. White's criticism that he didn't really walk through the text. But anyway, we're going to just jump right in. And we're going to start with Dr. Flowers' opening statement. And I'm going to start and stop it. And we'll take a look at the text and we'll take a look at his presentation. And that'll probably be all we'll get done today in this episode. And then in the next episode, we can maybe get into the cross-examination portion, which is really where, you know, in this debate anyway, a lot of stuff. And then there was a couple of question and answers. But let's just jump right in. Here's Flowers walking up, if you're watching, to start his presentation on John 6:44. And the topic of the debate proposition is, does John 6:44 teach unconditional election?
While they're getting that set up, I want to offer a few thank yous. I want to thank Caleb and Jeff for coming in and helping with everything here. I want to thank Trinity Seminary, where I am a professor of theology, for all their help and preparation. And I want to especially thank First Lutheran, and Pastor Evan. It takes a lot of work. I wanted to have something he remembered me by, and maybe when he sees it, he can voice me. Well, as many have followed him on Twitter, and for him to endure that and to be here, I appreciate it.
Okay, so this is where Leighton, we can include this in the review just because it's kind of funny. You know, Leighton is trying to be, you know, reach out to Olive Branch, mainly to Dr. White here, and do something funny at the beginning. So here's what he does.
Him making that happen, even though he was not feeling well. In fact, since he was coming to my home state of Texas, I thought maybe I'd take him out to Texas Roadhouse and get him a big old slab of choice meat.
If you don't know what the Leighton Flowers choice meats thing is, you must live in a cave and never go on the internet. But yeah, look it up. Just Google Leighton Flowers choice meats, and you'll see memes and videos and all kinds of stuff.
But then, you know, he couldn't have something to take with him, and I want him to have something in his studio. Though, you know, the sword's there, you know, and the lava lamp and the little straw man and everything. I want him to have something he remembered me by, and maybe when he sees it, he can pray for me when I'm out evangelizing and doing all my other ministries. So I got him this little one-string banjo. It's got a little case, and it's got a little stand that I'll sit up on, but I'm going to hold on to it until the end of the debate because I'm going to be plucking on that a lot tonight. So
if you don't know what that refers to, Dr. White has said a million times that Dr. Flowers and Soteriology 101 is a one-string banjo, meaning that all he does is put up content against Calvinism, which is factually correct if you go on Soteriology 101. And then more than half of his content is against James White. So anyway, okay, so that's out of the way. And then Dr. White, actually, I heard him say on a later, he never took the one-string banjo. He never even received it. So he just left it there, which, you know, I would have taken the one-string banjo. Okay, here we go.
All right, let's start our time. Does John 6, wait, don't start our time. Let me
And by the way, something that First Lutheran did that was good is they turned the live comments off. So the live comments it's just better to just have them off. I like that they did that. A lot of these debates, the live comments is just a dumpster fire of trolls. So here we go.
Let me pull out my clock because I'm going to start my time too. Okay, I'm learning to do my timing better. Dr. White has taught me that. Okay, here's the question. Does John 6:44 teach the Calvinistic doctrine of unconditional election? I'm wondering if my opponent remembers that's the question because I heard nothing on establishing unconditional election in his talk. He read through the text and gave us some commentary, 95% of it, which I go, yep, that sounds great. There's no contention here. Hopefully I can offer a little bit more. Let's define our terms.
So if he's saying that Dr. White didn't explicitly build up the doctrine of unconditional election on John 6:44, okay, fair enough. But if he's saying that he agrees with Dr. White's exegesis walking through verse by verse John 6, and there's no contention with the working through the text, he did that. He did this in the Romans 9 debate too. Well, I don't have a problem with 95% of what Dr. White says. It's the presuppositions that we disagree with. And actually, C.J. Cox has a good thing on that video I recommend that you watch with Turton Fan and in Conversations of Calvinism. He says the point of exegesis is to eliminate presuppositions that you're bringing to the text. And Dr. Flowers seemed to think it's all about presuppositions. So let's start his presentation here.
From Dr. White's book, he cites Edwin Palmer stating, quote, "Divine election is always an unconditional election. God never bases his choice on what man thinks, says, does, or is. We do not know what God bases his choice on." So Dr. White and I both believe that God the Father is giving to his Son those who already belong to him. Did you hear that? The only difference is that Dr. White says we don't know why some people belong to the Father and others don't. It's just a divine mystery hidden in the secret counsel of his will. Whereas we believe those who belong to the Father are those who listened and learned from what he taught. They believed the Father, so now they are being given to his Son. And I'll demonstrate that this evening, starting in chapter 6, beginning in verse 32. Jesus is speaking to a Jewish...
Okay, so there he lays out his position pretty clearly. So what Dr. Flowers is going to argue is that John 6:44, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Those who are coming to the Father because they're being drawn by the Father because they have first listened and learned from the Father. So they meet a condition which then causes the Father to draw them to the Son. So we'll see. That's the basic interpretation of John 6:44 that he offers, is that John 6:45 is teaching that first these Jews, and he limits it to the Jews, and we'll talk about that, because they have heard and learned from the Father first, that is why they're drawn to the Father, or drawn to the Son by the Father. Okay? Versus, and it's not fair, and Dr. White pushes back against this, and Leighton says, that Calvinist doesn't know what God bases his choice on. Well, yeah, we do. It's for the praise of his glorious grace in Ephesians 1. And there is a mystery, and that's, Dr. Flowers is lost in the labyrinth. That's from Calvin. Calvin talked about when we try to peer into the mysteries of God, we get lost and driven mad by the labyrinth of the doctrine of predestination. Many provisionists are lost in the labyrinth, wandering around. It's just true.
Jewish crowd of superficial followers who are not genuine believers, as Dr. White acknowledged, and they asked him for a sign like the manna that Moses gave. And he says to them, Moses didn't give you the bread from heaven, my Father did, and now he gives you the true bread from heaven. God gives his Son the bread of life to the whole world, just like he already taught back in John 3:6.
Okay, let's stop there. So John 6:32, and this is a, I understand the middle ground here, okay? Is Dr. Flowers allowed to jump out of John 6 this early in his presentation and run to John 3:16? Even the way I just said that is biased. Yes. But it is a fair criticism that he jumps out of the context constantly. Just Dr. Flowers, if you just walked through John 6 verse by verse first and then brought in these other texts to explain it, it it would be presented in a way that Dr. White would be forced to say, okay, that time Dr. Flowers did walk through the text. And then, yeah, he brought in all this other stuff from the outside, but he did that after he walked through the text. Breaking it up this way, it's still just visually, it looks like you're not exegeting the text. But remember, and this is important for me in my understanding of this text, and I haven't heard it brought out. I never hear it brought out, even from the Reform side. Where Dr. Flowers started in 632, Jesus is, remember, this is right after the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, where this large crowd who was following Jesus because they saw the signs, they ate till their bellies were full. They were hungry. They had a hunger for the physical bread. And now what Jesus is doing, and this happens in John 5 as well, there's a miracle and then there's a teaching based on the miracle, right? Now, as they've crossed the sea, a lot of Exodus, tons of Exodus language here. It's the Passover. They cross over to the sea to the other side. And now Jesus is saying, okay, we're going to use that miracle I just did where you were hungry for the bread and you came to me for bread that was physical bread. Now we're going to talk about you coming to me for the living bread, the analogy, right? So we're looking at physical bread, and this isn't a parable, by the way, and that's what Leighton tries to put this in the category. Anyway, so now we are asking the question, why are these people being offered another type of bread? And now they have no appetite for it. They have no hunger to receive and feast on this bread, but they had hunger to receive and feast on the bread on the other side, the physical bread, right? So, in that, I think the analogy of hunger helps when we talk about the versus hearing and learning, which I know is in the text, but in the background, it's very clear that this is about hungering and thirsting, right? And I think that analogy of us having physical hunger and thirst, why don't they have a spiritual hunger for the Son? And of course, it's because they are not given by the Father and they are not being drawn by the Father. But let's see what he does. So he's saying the bread is being presented, and then Moses gives, I give you the bread, is what his point. Now he jumps to John 3:16.
16, for God so loved the world that he what? He gave. God is the initiator. We are the responders. He gives the bread of life to every spiritually dead sinner. Why does he do that? So that we may eat and live. If you refuse to eat of the bread that he gave to the world, then you won't live. You won't receive that gift, then you won't live. Back in John 5.
So we don't disagree with that. So that's never the point of contention with provisionists. We agree that a condition in order to live is you need to receive the bread. And we furthermore agree that God presents that bread to humanity. We agree with that. The issue is, why do some receive and others do not? And what is the connection to that with God's knowledge and God's plan and God creating the universe in the way he did? I mean, that's the issue. So there's no disagreement. We as Calvinists who believe in a divine decree of election and reprobation, we agree that a condition of becoming in Christ and becoming part of the new covenant and becoming saved is faith. We agree with that. Well, no, you don't, because you're determinist. So there is no conditions. No, that's not it.
5:43, Jesus says, I've come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me, which reflects back on what was said in John 1:12.
Okay, well, we'll stop here. So once again, this is after the miracle of the paralyzed man, the paralytic, being raised up to walk. But Jesus is talking to the Jews here. And yes, I've come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. Yes, they are not receiving Christ, 100%. But is there a theme? And here's where I do agree with how Dr. Flowers is handling this. I just don't agree with his conclusions. But I do agree that starting with John 1, where he's about to go, there is a theme that is a thread that goes all the way through the Gospel of John, which John is explaining why do some receive Jesus as the Messiah and why do others reject. I think John does have an explanation for that, and it is not found or rooted in libertarian free will, that God is trying to save everyone, but only those who allow him by their libertarian free will, separate from the grace of God. And this is where provisionism is different than Arminianism, if you're not familiar with this. Arminianism would at least say, well, no one is able to receive him by nature because of total depravity and original sin. So prevenient grace has to come in and liberate their will, and then they're able to receive. See, the provisionists reject that. They say we have an intact libertarian free will that isn't even infected by sin. And the only impact that the libertarian free will can have in provisionism is if you harden yourself. And provisionists haven't really worked out the response to, well, can you harden yourself to the point where you lose your libertarian free will? And with many things that Dr. Flowers has said, it seems like that's yes. Okay, so now what he's going to do is he's going to jump to John 1 now to continue his argument.
As many as receive him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. In other words, this Israelite crowd is responsible for whether or not they receive God's gift to them.
Okay, so John 1:12. I'm surprised Dr. Flowers quoted it the way he did. And I'm just not going to do Bible works for sake of time. I just have my NIV Bible in front of me here. So John 1:12, right? Of course. John 1:12, which he's quoting, it's, he came to that which was his own, and his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Is that the end of the sentence? And actually, look how Dr. Flowers actually puts it on his PowerPoint. He put a period there. There's not a period. The sentence continues. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, nor of a husband's will, but born of God. So is that birth so becoming children, right? That implies a birth. Where does that birth come from? It comes from God. Their reception of Jesus does not cause them to become children of God. And it's actually interesting language, right? He gave them the right to become children of God. What causes them to become children of God is that they are born of God, right? And of course, where's that explained in a couple chapters? In John 3 with Nicodemus. You must be born again in order to see or enter the kingdom of heaven, right? Okay, let's continue.
God isn't obligated to provide a gift to everyone, but he does because he's abundantly gracious. But let's just suppose that the Calvinists...
So why, I found that interesting a little, that was a little, why isn't, I would have asked this in the cross-ex, why isn't God obligated to, because you just admitted he's not obligated to provide this for everyone, but he does because he's gracious. So why isn't he obligated? What does his grace need to overcome? To get him to talk a little more about original sin and total depravity, which is the major problem with the provisionist system.
Is right and that God didn't give this gift to everyone, then what is the sinner really rejecting on Calvinism? He isn't rejecting the bread of life, because on Calvinism, the bread of life is not given to the non-elect. You see, if Calvinism is true, those who remain in unbelief are merely rejecting a God who first rejected them. Provisionism, on the other hand, teaches that God gives the bread of life to all dead sinners so that they may eat in order to live. And if they don't receive it, that is their own fault. They are rejecting a God who patiently holds out his hands, making an appeal and providing a real gift that he has actually purchased for them. As it says in Ezekiel 18.
Okay, there was a lot there before you could do Ezekiel 18. So the other thing with this debate and this whole topic is Dr. Flowers, and that sounds very compelling, right? Well, the Calvinists teach that God created a whole bunch of people that he just didn't even want to save. He doesn't even desire to save them. He didn't even provide for them. There's a whole bunch of people who they can't receive the bread because it was never intended for them. God didn't want to give them the bread. So no matter what, they can't receive the bread because God already predestined them to not receive the bread because they're reprobate, right? Now, this is where this issue of the knowledge of God comes, and God's knowledge pre-creation. So, for example, and I'm more used to debating Arminians, and what's interesting is the deeper provisionism goes in developing its theology, the closer it brings Arminians and Calvinists, classical Arminians. It really does. So, on Dr. Flowers' view, okay, so before God created the universe, did he know with absolute certainty who he created would refuse to receive the bread? Staying with the analogy here. If the answer to that is yes, then the provisionist has the same problem as the Calvinist. Now, they could say, well, yeah, our problem is a better problem than your problem, but it's still there. What's the problem? That God still created, going with Leighton's thing later, if you've watched this already, Rob the reprobate. When God created Rob the reprobate, according to Leighton, did God know that Rob would never, ever, ever receive Christ, no matter how much God wooed him, no matter how much God tried to draw him, that God knew with perfect certainty before he created that human being that he would never accept the gospel, would never come to Christ? If the answer to that is yes, God in that system still created Rob the reprobate with no ability to accept. Well, no, you gotta understand, there's middle knowledge, or God have foreknew. Anything you try to do introduces another force besides God's decree that determines the shape of the time, space, reality, and what God creates. And that's a much bigger theological issue than Calvinism, trust me. When you say, well, no, God isn't the one responsible for Rob not creating. There's some other thing. What? Rob's free will? Did that free will exist before God created him? Well, yes. Where? Nothing else is created yet. All of this is within the simple say God. Okay? Well, and this is where it gets, but anyway, it creates serious problem with your doctrine of God. That is why many provisionism attracts many open theists. Because the open theist totally gets around this by bringing in the false doctrine of God does not have omniscience, and God cannot know what a free creature is going to do from all eternity. He can't know. Okay, done. All right, 21 minutes. We're never going to get, well, we're probably not going to get through his opening statement, but let's try.
For I have no pleasure in the death of anyone who dies, says the sovereign Lord. Therefore repent and live. Now notice that Jesus knows.
Okay, so I was going to go read Ezekiel 18. That is literally the last verse of the entire chapter, Ezekiel 18, which is about a certain topic. The topic is the Israelites, the later generations are quoting a proverb, our fathers ate sour grapes, so our teeth are set on edge. Okay? And what that meant was we're being punished only for our father's sins and not for our own. That's what's going on. And God takes pleasure in punishing us for something we didn't even do. So what this text is talking about is when it says, I have no pleasure in the death of anyone who dies, this isn't some general universal principle. This is addressing what it's really saying is, for I have no pleasure in the death of anyone who dies because of their own sin. I'm not just taking pleasure in judging you because of your father's sin. I'm judging you because of your sin. The soul that sins will die, not the soul that's related to the sinner will die. That's really what's happening there. So this passage really has zero relevance to what is the will of God toward those who die in their sin. It just doesn't. It's got a specific context. All right, next.
Knows that even though this Jewish crowd followed him across the sea, as Dr. White rightly pointed out, he says in verse 36 about them, you have seen me, yet you don't believe. But here's the question. Why aren't they believing? John 1:11 tells us.
Okay, so that is the question. Why aren't they believing? They have seen the signs, they have seen the miracles, they have heard the teaching, yet Jesus himself, and that's a pronouncement by Jesus, you are not believing. You do not have true faith in me. Yeah, why are they unbelieving? And then he pulls up this picture of is it the high priest from Passion of the Christ, the actor who plays the high priest? Crucify. Yeah, that's interesting.
Us that Jesus came to his own, the Israelites, and the Israelites were not receiving him. Why not? How we answer that question is a major point of contention in tonight's debate.
Okay, so see what he did? Now he goes to John 1:11. We already went through John 1:12. He goes back to John 1:11. We already talked about that. There is a theme running through the Gospel of John. Those who did receive him had the right to become children of God, but they became children of God because they were born of God. So God is the cause of them receiving because of the new birth. And John 6 is just an extension on that thread that starts at John 3, goes to John 5, and now we're in John 6. And yes, it's in John 5. The dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Right? How do the dead hear voices? They have to be brought back to life so their eardrums work again. Anyway, that's the point of the analogy. Okay.
Calvinism presupposes, listen to that word, presupposes that the reason this grumbling Israelite crowd isn't believing is because of the tea of their tulip. As Dr. White explained.
Okay. So, and Dr. White, or Dr. Flowers wants to call, it is funny, in his rebuttal, I think, he's like, oh, that's what presuppositionalists do, what Dr. White does. He presupposes everything. When Dr. Flowers is the one reading his I mean, they're both doing presupposition, and that just, that's not going to win any points with the Calvinists if he's trying to win Calvinists over to his side. We understand presuppositionalism as an apologetic method. It doesn't have anything to do with exegeting the text necessarily. Now, and the other thing about this statement, so here's the thing. Okay, that's true as far as it goes, but it's not only the Calvinists who hold to this. We could change this to Arminianism. Classical Arminianism presupposes that the reason these grumbling Israelites aren't believing is because of, now you could, if it's not tulip because it's a Calvinist, fine, but because of the doctrine of original sin, which leads to total inability. Okay? So it's not just us Calvinists that have a strong doctrine that Adam's sin transmitted to us, that nature incapacitates us from being able to believe upon the Son of God without an act of grace, an internal act of grace. Very important when you're dealing with a provisionist. They will talk about grace all the time, but they never locate it in an internal work of the Holy Spirit. It's always just in an external presentation of the information of the gospel. That's where the grace is located, in the external presentation. It's not located in any internal, Leighton will use the word, whenever he's talking about mystical. Well, we don't need a mystical work of God in order for us to be saved. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about, he doesn't even like prevenient grace, which is so if you're new to this debate, the classical debate between a Calvinist and Arminian would be that we both agree that there is total inability, and we both agree that God's grace is necessary to overcome that total inability. The Calvinist will just say that grace is effectual for the elect and cannot be resisted. The classical Arminian would say that grace is upon all and it can be resisted. That's normally how this debate goes. But then the provisionists come along several years ago and they say, no, you don't even need prevenient grace. All you need is the presentation of the information of the gospel, and you have an intact, totally intact libertarian free will to respond to that message unless you've judicially hardened yourself. Then you don't. And that's kind of their explanation for how to deal with, there is strong passages that show that people are not believing because of some inability. But no, they brought that inability upon themselves. They're not born that way. They're not born that way. Okay? So there is a sense in which this is the point of contention, but it's still, and this, a lot of the debate reviews have said this, it's maybe the debate statement is, Dr. Flowers may have actually followed the statement more closely than Dr. White, because the thing should have just been, what does John 6:44 mean? Like that's just what it should have just said. That should have been, instead of, does John 6:44 teach unconditional election? Because Leighton really latched onto that debate title to give him, I think, properly, the permission to talk about a larger biblical doctrine and not just the exegesis of the text of John 6. I mean, it really did. All right, let's continue.
On page 32 of his book, by default, I'm quoting from him, by default.
All right, this is why these debates should just be, there should be a requirement that the opening statement of the positive presenter is given to the opponent. Why is he quoting from old Dr. White book? He should be quoting from his opening statement. Now, you can't do that in real time, so I don't blame Leighton for doing this. If you don't get the opening statement of your opponent ahead of time, you have to present your own opening statement, and you do have to just research what the person does. Like, their writings, their podcasts, their public material. Of course, that's how you would gather, but material for an opening statement against their position. But it just seems like it doesn't help the debate at all. It's better to let's talk about what actually the person's going to present that day. And then you're responding to that, and you can you know, articulate your response based on what they're going to say first. There's just something that gets more and more frustrating to me about these debate formats, where I don't know why you can't say, listen, we're going to plan this debate out, and can you please present to me, in even skeletal form, where you're going to go in your opening statement, so I can consider my response to it. But instead, it's like he said this in this book, But anyway, let's see what he says.
Man sinfully rejects God, end quote. John MacArthur said mankind is, quote, by nature pre-programmed to believe lies. So why is Israel rejecting their own Messiah here in John chapter 6? According to Calvinism, because they were decreed by God to be born by default, unable to believe what he teaches. They are born pre-programmed to believe lies. I believe that is...
Okay, that is... No Calvinist says that we are born Now, I guess he's quoting MacArthur. Pre-programmed. Yeah, I wouldn't use that language, especially if I'm dealing with a provisionist. Oh, pre-programmed. But here, let's wait till
it's a wrong, unbiblical presupposition, which, by the way, even numerous Calvinistic scholars, including John Calvin himself, confess that these doctrines were first introduced into the church by Augustine, a former Manichaean Gnostic from Africa in the 5th century. That erroneous Calvinist...
Okay. Oh, that's my pet peeve. So these ideas were introduced into the church by a former Manichaean Gnostic named Augustine. These guys' disdain for the doctor of grace, as he's called by the universal church, and the doctor of the church. Is he a heretic, Dr. Flowers? I would ask him that in Cross-X. Is Augustine a heretic? Are you formally declaring him a heretic? Okay, because if someone says that, just know that they, and for Leighton, I know this for a fact because I asked him this on this program before. It's not that he isn't intelligent enough to study church history. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about church history. He told me, I don't care what Augustine says any more than what you said. I'm just like, you have to understand historical theology to understand these concepts of grace and human freedom. Augustine wrote about it. It's just the same way of saying, well, the doctrine of the Trinity was, introduced into the church by some former pagans and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, many of the church fathers, okay, you could talk about their former way of life. Augustine's just the only one who actually wrote about it in his Confessions, right? But I guarantee you could make the same argument. The anti-Trinitarian could probably come along and say, well, Athanasius, what he came out of, and what some of these church fathers, Gregory and all these people, they came out of, hardcore paganism to come to Christ, and they were influenced to create the doctrine of the Trinity that way. Oh, it just drives me crazy, not understanding like what Augustine was doing, what his arguments were, what scriptures he went to. No, all that is just blown out of the water because he was a former Manichaean Gnostic. So we don't even need to study Augustine and with the arguments he was making against Pelagius. Oh, and by the way, Pelagius wasn't that bad of a guy. He's just misunderstood. Is what they say. But anyway, back to Dr. Fowler's presentation. In other words, it doesn't matter what the exegesis you present of John 6. Your presupposition of the T of tulip will, unless you drop that, you can't understand John 6. That's what I get out of this type of presentation. Your presupposition is so strong that you will never understand John 6 the way it's supposed to be understood, like we provisionists do, because we are not bound by this Manichaean Gnostic presupposition that you bring to the table, right? That's basically what he's saying. And it's just poisoning the well. I mean, stop calling Augustine a at least he said former. Okay, I'll give Dr. Flowers credit for that. A lot of people would say, oh, these modern Calvinists are just Manichaean Gnostics.
Presupposition dictates how they interpret John 6 and the rest of the Bible. Listen, it does not matter.
But we can interpret the Bible like provisionists do. They have the proper interpretation because they aren't blinded by Manichaean Gnosticism. You see what that does? I mean, that's good choice red meat for your followers to get clicks and shares, which you want to get the most rabid people to subscribe to your channel. But yeah, don't get me started on the whole why these debates end up being the way they do, because it's for public consumption in online forum. If this was not being recorded and it would never get out of the walls of that church, and it would just be word of mouth by how this debate would be received, it would be totally different. Totally different. The way that it's done, but it's all about, I need more subscribers, I need more clicks. And I think that's what Leighton was doing. I mean, in the reviews they've done and all the fodder they've gotten to get more and more subscribers, like, share, subscribe. It's very subtle, and it's very tempting.
No matter how good your exegetical methodology is or how well you know Greek, if you start with the wrong presupposition, then you will arrive at the wrong interpretation in both languages.
No, I don't agree with that. So C.J. Cox, like I said, made a great point when he was on with Turton, Fan, and Dan. No, it's exactly the opposite of that. Solid exegesis is what forms your presuppositions. It's not the other way around. Now, you could say that our presupposition of total inability is wrong, but we have exegetical texts that we go through as Reformed, which we believe forms the presupposition of the doctrine of total inability. Text after text after text after text. And Dr. Flowers has spent a lot of time and energy trying to exegete those texts in a way that destroys their meaning. And I do not agree with how he interprets Romans 8, 7, and 8, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Ephesians chapter 1 and 2 about being dead in sin. He does everything he can to turn those around. No, they don't mean that. They don't mean what the Calvinists say. And they try to give a counter exegesis, which ends up turning into, and it just does, well, it can't mean this because it would be determinism. It can't mean this because it would mean that God's sovereign in the matter of salvation. It can't mean this. And like I said, the classical Arminians agree with our exegesis as Calvinists on those texts that form what Dr. Flowers here is calling the quote-unquote presupposition of total inability. They agree with our exegesis, and they would say, no, there is the exegesis of those texts does create the, if you want to call it a presupposition, I would just call it a doctrine of total inability. And yes, that informs other passages of Scripture. Absolutely. Just like Dr. Flowers' presupposition of libertarian free will. And that's also a presupposition of his that he brings to the table to every text. That human beings are born with no impact from Adam's sin whatsoever. They are born innocent. They are born without a sin nature. And the sin nature, now, that's what's interesting. Dr. Flowers, I think, is still, I think he's going to move away from this now that he's no longer in the Southern Baptists and employed by Southern Baptists. But he's not like Warren McGrew. Warren McGrew would just be like, we do not have a sin nature by birth. That is horrible teaching. I think Dr. Flowers would admit, no, we do have a nature from birth that we inherit from Adam that has the propensity to sin. Okay. And now how that works out is how you get to either total inability or you get to some form of Arminianism, or not even like Finneyism, which there's a big distinction between. Most people who call themselves Arminians today are not classical Arminians who try to go back to Wesley and then back to Arminius. They're Finneists. They're Finneites. They follow Charles Finney. And that's that most people believe what Charles Finney believed about original sin and inability. Anyway, let's keep going.
So our point of contention is not about Greek grammar or exegetical methodologies, nor is it about me.
So doesn't Greek grammar and exegetical methodologies create your doctrine? I'm sorry.
And whether or not I was really reformed or if I'm too man-centered, all of those talking points are red herrings that will only distract us from what is our main point of contention in tonight's debate, which can be summarized as follows. Calvinists presume this audience is unbelieving by default. That's White's words, by default. Whereas provisionists teach this audience is unbelieving by their fault. In other words, provisionists reject the Augustinian Calvinistic presupposition of total inability. So how do we as provisionists answer the question? Why?
So just so understand, so Dr. Flowers' point is going to be, I'm going to look at the language of the reason you're not believing, so all the Father gives me will come to me. So this action of the Father called giving, and then the action of the Father called drawing, all that is going to be. So he's saying, well, God doesn't have to give and draw because of total inability. Well, God takes those actions because he sees that they haven't rejected the Messiah first, that they haven't rejected first. That's basically his point. So his presupposition is, I don't believe in total inability. I believe in libertarian freedom. So I have to reinterpret the actions of God in John 6, which is the giving of the Father, right? And the drawing of the Father. I have to interpret those as something God responds to humanity with. Those are actions of God that are responsive to something he sees humans do first, not active upon humans first. That's Dr. Our position is, yes, John talks about men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. That is the state they're in, according to the end of John 3. Okay? That is the state they are in. Okay? And because of that, the drawing and the giving are necessary because God has to do these actions. In Leighton's view, no. But that's where it doesn't work exegetically, because you can't take it. So the whole crux of this debate came down to the action of drawing. Leighton turned into, well, that's God responding to those who have heard and learned. So once God sees that they have fulfilled a condition, namely hearing and learning, then he draws them. But if they don't hear and learn, he does not draw them. And Dr. White did a pretty good job of poking a million holes in that in cross-sex, but we're at the cross-sex. Okay, so why does Israel reject their own Messiah? These people have become callous because they have closed their eyes, as Paul told them. Okay, let's listen to this.
Why? It has to do with the condition. Why is Israel rejecting their own Messiah? Well, according to Scripture, despite God's long suffering and holding out his hands to Israel all day long, as Romans 10:21 says, these people have, quote, become calloused because they have closed their eyes, as Paul told us in Acts 28. As both Jesus and the prophet Isaiah declared, God was willing to gather Israel under his wings. He was willing to save them, but they were not willing. So I submit to you that contrary to the Calvinistic view, they are not in this condition because God was unwilling, or because they were by default born unable to believe, or because Jesus doesn't really love these Israelites. Remember, Jesus wept over the unbelief of Israel, saying, would that you had known on this day the things that were made for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. What does he mean they're hidden from their eyes? John 12:39 tells us plainly why Israel can't believe. Quote, for this reason they could not believe. God has blinded their eyes. Consider how this too is contrary to the Calvinistic assumption. Why would God blind their eyes or hide the truth from them if they were born by default unable to see or hear or turn? Why put a blindfold on a corpse? Notice this hardened condition of Israel is not a universal default condition of all humanity from birth. It is a purposeful divine judicial judgment upon a rebellious people at a particular place and time so as to bring about Calvary through their rebellion.
Okay, so I do think us Calvinists need to do a better job incorporating into our understanding of these texts that Leighton just went through that there is something similar to what's going on in the Exodus with the Passover and how God hardened Pharaoh's heart to bring about the Passover, right? God is hardening the Jews' heart in order to bring about the greater Passover that is Jesus Christ. I think we need to. I think we don't do a good enough a job incorporating that. Now, I would say we can have both. We can say that that is part of what's going on in the earthly ministry of Christ. He is hardening hearts in order to bring about salvation. Right? Paul talks about this in Romans 9-11, the hardening that's come upon the Jews. But we can also teach the doctrine of total inability alongside that. Dr. Flowers makes it an either or. He's about to say it. Why do you have to blindfold someone who's blind? Okay. Well, you're mixing category. We can have two categories here. We can have the category of there's something going on in space and time, in real time, which needs to happen for Jesus to go to the cross, right? To be the Passover lamb. Just like there had to be 10 plagues and Pharaoh's heart had to be hardened in order to get to the point where the final plague was the death of the firstborn, just like the final act of Jesus is him being hung on a cross and bleeding and dying as the Passover lamb, right? Even to the point where John says a hyssop branch is what was used to offer Jesus his final drink, right? What was used to apply the blood of the lamb to the doorpost in the Passover? A hyssop branch. It's really cool. We can talk about that, but that doesn't invalidate the teaching of the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 2. So it's both. And the other thing about Leighton's hermeneutic is the way he's able to do this is he says, well, this was about the Jews of Jesus's time, implying that there's nothing that can be taught to the church based on what Jesus's interactions were with the Jews. Which that's really what ends up happening when this hermeneutic is praised to its logical conclusion. Well, that was for that time when Jesus walked the earth. This teaching was, and Dr. White presses him hard in the cross-ex. So you're saying this is only for the Jews. So you're saying the drawing of the Father that Jesus is talking about and the coming to the Son and hearing and learning, that's only for the Jews? Well, yes, absolutely. It's a different drawing now because of John 12:32, which my Arminian friends, I think, don't agree with that. And Dr. Fauzi even points that out. But anyway, the other thing that I was going to say, Matthew 23:37, Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, all this stuff. The minute that you hold to a divine foreknowledge that God knew from all eternity before he created, that he would become incarnate and he would stand before Jerusalem and weep over them as the incarnate man, okay? Oh, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would Jesus weep over those that he has predetermined, okay, to not save, or predetermined that they would be rebellious against him, right? You Calvinists, why would, if everything's predetermined, it makes no sense for Jesus to weep over those who, are rejecting him, because he predetermined them to reject, right? That's what they love to do with Matthew 23:37. However, if God knew with perfect certainty from all eternity, with perfect omniscience and foreknowledge, you could say it the same way. Why is Jesus weeping over those who he already knew would reject him in the first place? It shouldn't come as a surprise to him. That's why the consistent view is open theism. And that's why all these non-Calvinist systems, when they push and push and push and keep throwing mud at Calvinism over and over and over again, the thing that keeps you safe from this, ladies and gentlemen, is you use the category of mystery and you say, listen, there's a point where I don't agree with these Calvinists, right? I think that God wants to save everyone and there's a genuine responsibility and ability for people to believe. But ultimately, when I keep pushing it back behind the sin of Adam and Eve, why did that happen? The fall of the angels, why did that happen? I end up saying it's a mystery. And that there must be a sense in which this is unfolding according to God's plan in some way. Now, if you don't take that position, then you end up just pushing, and your anti-Calvinism makes you just more and more and more rabid against Calvinism, then what you end up saying is you end up becoming an open theist. You end up denying that, because if you continue to hold to the foreknowledge of God, the perfect foreknowledge of God, which he possessed before he created the universe, you have to admit that there's some sense in which this is part of God's plan. Okay, let's continue. We're at 48 minutes, okay, and I'm not even halfway through his opening.
Furthermore, this also explains why Jesus only spoke to the large Jewish crowds using parables or symbolism. According to Mark 4:34, Jesus would not speak to the Jewish crowds without...
Oops, sorry, I went back. My bad, that was my fault. Hit the little button on my
rebellion.
mouse.
Furthermore, this also explains why Jesus...
I did want to say something. He did quote John 12, but he didn't really walk through John 12 and what it's saying about the Jews and the quote from Isaiah and stuff like that. But anyway.
Jesus only spoke to the large Jewish crowds using parables or symbolism. According to Mark...
Okay, so that's a big difference. Parables and symbolism are different. So it's very clear in the Gospels when Jesus is telling a parable. I don't think Jesus tells any parables in the Gospel of John, actually. Like, that language is reserved for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I I don't know if he has grounding to. He subtly said, "Well, there's parables and symbols," and he's equating the two. I don't think they're the same, because what he wants to say is that John 6 is a parable. I don't think John 6 is a parable. I don't. I think it's a connection to the Exodus. And Jesus is the new Exodus. He's the Passover lamb. He's the greater fulfillment of the bread that came down from heaven in the wilderness after the Israelites were freed from from their slavery in Egypt. Anyway.
Mark 4:34, Jesus would not speak to the Jewish crowds without parables, but privately he would explain all things to his own disciples. Now, don't you think that's an important piece of information to understand when you're discussing a text in which Jesus uses very difficult symbolic language like eat my flesh and drink my blood, which drives away the crowd of superficial followers?
No, I don't, because he's not telling a parable. So I don't see the connection between what Jesus does when he's speaking in parables and what's going on in John 6. I don't see that.
This is why we say context is key. The historical context, according to Paul in Romans 11, is that God gave Israel a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, ears that would not hear. Paul said Israel was cut off because of their unbelief. They were not born.
So he just cut and edited and pasted scriptures together. We got to look that up. So he's quoting Romans 11, right? Okay. So this is interesting. So look what he does here. So instead of putting a scripture quotation, Romans 11, he does historical context of Romans 11. So let's see. Let's see if he quoted this, or if I think he cut it and then pasted it back together. Could be wrong though. Let me look. Romans 11. So the text he is citing here. Okay, so what Israel sought so earnestly, this is 11:7, it did not obtain, but the elect did. The others were hardened, as it is written. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, ears that could not hear, to this very day. And David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution to them. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent back forever. Did they know it all rather because of their transgression, salvation? But if I'm talking to you Gentiles, they were broken off because of unbelief. Israel was off because of unbelief. Okay, so that's I don't know what to call this. But you quote Romans 11:8. That's that first part, if you can see. Then you skip how many verses? 16, 15, 14 verses? You skip from 8 to 20, and then you cut 20 and you paste it into there. And then you don't give the reference. That's just not handling the Word of God well. I'm just sorry. That just isn't. All right. So anyway.
Paul said Israel was cut off because of their unbelief. They were not born cut off by default. No, it is their fault they're in this condition. So this Jewish...
And for Dr. Flowers, they're not even born with any effect of the sinful nature upon their wills whatsoever. None. Zero zilch. It's important to understand.
Crowd has become, quote, ever seeing but never perceiving, which is exactly what Jesus tells us in verse 36. By the way, that's exegetical commentary on just one verse, verse 36. Now we move to verse 37.
Okay, so that was Dr. Flowers' little dig. See, I am doing exegetical commentary. No, you're really not, Dr. Flowers. The stuff. I'm not saying what you just did there is not part of the process of hermeneutics / exegesis. But you start with what Dr. White did, and you walk verse by verse through the text in its own context. And then once you've established that, yes, then you can bring in other texts. So I don't agree that what he just did is equivalent to what Dr. White did.
And we're walking through the text just in case you're needing to follow that, right?
because this is the biggest complaint about his Romans 9 debate, which it was true. He did not walk through Romans 9, and he's doing the same exact thing. He really is. He's doing the same thing. He's not walking through the text. He's quoting a verse one at a time, and he is going in order, but then he's jumping to all kinds of other scripture verses. It's obvious. I mean, you can see that's what he's doing.
Verse 37, Jesus rebukes the Israelite crowd for their unbelief by saying, all the Father gives me will come to me. In other words, Jesus is saying, you superficial followers, you're not being given to come to me because I know your true intentions. The Father is not entrusting you to me because you're not genuinely following me. You're here to fill your bellies.
So the action of the Father giving to the Son, notice Dr. Flower's interpretation will end up being the giving of the Father only happens when the Jews, by their libertarian free will, hear the teaching, which they all have heard, and the teaching comes and they hear and they learn. If you've heard and learned from the Father will give you to me. So he actually takes John 6:45 and reads it all the way back into 6:37. So understand, notice, this action of the Father giving, is totally interpreted in light of not anything the Father actually does until there's a response, a libertarian free will response from the sinner. But it's only for the Jews. So we can't even use this text to apply to today, because this is actually only for the Jews. And I think that's a huge hermeneutical, very problematic thing created by how provisionists are doing this.
You're not being entrusted to the Son by the Father. You cannot ignore the key question. Who is the Father giving to his Son and why? Again, here's where Dr. White and I really part ways. Calvinism teaches they are by default unable to believe because they are not given to Christ. We teach they are not being given to Christ because of their continued refusal to believe all that the Father has already taught them. Notice what the text says. All those the Father is giving to the Son will come and not be cast out. The Greek word for gives here is didomi, the same.
Let me go back to that, because that slide's helpful. That slide is helpful. It does lay out the major points of contention here. So Calvinism, so for Calvinism teaches that they are by default unable to believe because they are not given to Christ. So, well, yes. So we believe that according to the text, Jesus is looking at this crowd, and they've seen the signs, and they've ate the bread, but they are not believing in him. Right? They have a false faith. This goes all the way through the Gospel of John. It starts all the way back at John 2, when it says, and I think Dr. Flowers brings this up, when Jesus did not entrust himself to them because he knew it was in a man. Now, what's in a man? Well, he teaches it in John 3. That which is flesh gives birth to flesh. That which is spirit gives birth to spirit. But Dr. Flowers doesn't seem to think that which gives birth to flesh is flesh means that there's something about human nature where they cannot believe unless there is a action of God, which is, what's the action of God in John 3? To be born again. It's the same teaching here. Why? What is needed to overcome the natural unbelief of the Jews here? An action of God called being given. Right? That's all we're saying. And yes, there is a doctrine of original sin that lies behind this, which, where we get into really hot water is, at least with the classical Arminian, we have agreement on the doctrine of original sin. The provisionists totally reject even the classical Arminian doctrine of original sin and total inability. And they have people like Warren McGrew, who is a complete and total Pelagian, who would totally reject any influence whatsoever of Adam's fall upon humanity. The only thing he'll acknowledge is it brought external death. But I wonder if McGrew he would probably admit that, well, no, Adam and Eve would have died anyway, even if they didn't eat from the tree of knowledge. Because death is just a natural part of things. Because they don't want to link death to any of the consequences of Adam's sin, so they just make death just a natural part of reality anyway. But anyway, so provisionists, what do they teach? So it's by default, your fault. Well, by Adam's sin. And Dr. White brings this out too. The whole idea of federal headship is completely rejected by provisionists, like completely gone. Provisionism, in contrast, teaches they are not being given to Christ because of their continued refusal to believe all that the Father has taught them. Okay, so here we go. So the Father has taught all of this crowd of Jews. What he's taught them, it's not clear, but it's something about the Son and Jesus, that he's taught them about the Son, and they've refused to do that, and that's why they're not being given, and that's why they're not being drawn. So the actions of the Father are completely conditioned by libertarian free will choices of creatures. I mean, it's consistent with what they teach, what a synergist teaches. This is just a much more radical version of synergism than classical Arminianism ever dreamed of being. All right. Oh, we're at an hour.
All that the Father has already taught them.
A few minutes more.
Notice what the text says. All those the Father is giving to the Son will come and not be cast out. The Greek word for gives here is didomi, the same Greek word we saw earlier in John 3:16. For God gives his Son to the world, and now he's giving all who first believed in the Father over to his Son, so that they will be raised up with him. Now notice again, this is not an isolated incident. Where else do we see the verb didomi repeated in John 6? We see it again in verse 65, where you'll notice the same pattern. The unbelief of Israel is stated, followed by the rebuke of Jesus. Look at verse 64, where he says, some of you don't believe. He knew from the beginning which ones of them didn't believe. And then he goes on to say, it is for this reason they are not given by the Father to his Son. For what reason? He knew they weren't genuine followers. He knew their motives. This is just like back in chapter 2 when there was a...
Yeah, that's totally a mess. Who was that? Vic Rockhill. I went on his channel, and we talked about this. He totally whiffs that one completely. The John 6. That's not how John 6 reads. He's trying to do what he did with John 6:44 and 45 with the end of John 6, and it doesn't work. Because the statement at the end of John 6 is actually stronger than 6:44, in my opinion. Because we argue about the draw and all this stuff. Let's read. Let's go back. Let's bring that up. So John 6. Okay. Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, does this offend you? What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit and they are life. That was not even touched by Dr. Flowers. That's the whole key of this, the end of John 6. So he's speaking and the words are spirit and they are life. Oh, where does that remind you of? Oh, John 3. Oh, being born again by the who? By the Spirit. Oh, does this also remind you in John 3 where it says flesh gives birth to flesh, but spirit gives birth to spirit? Why is it that these individuals are grumbling against the teaching of Jesus? It's because the word he's speaking are spirit and they are life. What is the state of these people? They are flesh. The flesh counts for nothing. Okay? Yet there are some of you who do not believe. Okay, there's the quote, right? That he's totally missing that. Even the NIV, which doesn't always do the connecting words very well, there's a yet. So he leaves that out. This selective editing of how you quote scripture verses in this presentation, I don't like. Yet there are some of you who do not believe, okay? For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them. Once again, so is Dr. Flowers saying, well, what Jesus means there is their refusal to hear and learn from the Father is them being creating themselves as being flesh. So they are, so we can have a new category now. So you can be judicially hardened and you can be fleshed. You can be fleshy. You can be more fleshy than someone else. No, that language of flesh and spirit is very clear in the New Testament, what that refers to, especially in the Gospel of John and in the Apostle Paul. It has to do with, yes, a condition from birth that you're pre-programmed. No, the flesh is the nature we inherit from Adam. And what does that nature do to our ability to understand, see, hear, and believe and even obey the law, which ends up becoming another issue where this can end up compromising the gospel message at its core. Is if you ask a provisionist, well, is it possible for someone to be sinless? They will hedge on that, believe it or not. A provisionist will hedge on that question. Well, it's possible to be sinless but not feasible. Why do they hedge on that? Because they know that the minute they concede that the doctrine of original sin necessitates that everyone is born in a sinful condition and they cannot obey the law, it's not possible, then they have to take the next step and say, well, what else does the flesh we inherit from Adam make us unable to do? Right? But anyway, that's why I don't have a problem with the Arminian who says, I disagree with you Calvinists when you say that original sin makes it so that not even prevenient grace is sufficient to bring someone to the point where they can repent and believe in Christ, right, savingly. I believe that we don't need irresistible grace and an unconditional decree, but prevenient grace is needed to overcome what the flesh does to our ability to believe and receive Christ. I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with, well, you Calvinists, because an Arminian will agree that we cannot keep the law because of the flesh. They will heartily amen to that, and that's why we need the imputed righteousness of Christ. The provisionists, it seems to me, they have this massive hole in their theology, which ends up being, well, we even struggle with saying that because you're born in Adam, you will inevitably sin and you're born with a sinful nature from the womb. They don't seem to like that. Okay.
Which ones of them didn't believe? And then he goes on to say, it is for this reason they are not given by the Father to his Son. For what reason? He knew they weren't genuine followers.
That's not what it says. It says the reason, the direct context is the verse before. It says, my words are spirit. The flesh counts for nothing. My words are spirit, and the spirit gives life. Or there's life. Let me read it correctly. Once again, just so you see what he did there. The spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe. The whole point is, and this goes against Dr. Fowler's total thesis, the words that are being spoken, what's the nature of them? They're spiritual words. They're spirit. Why don't they receive them? Is it because they have made themselves into flesh? No, because they are flesh, and the spirit is what gives life, and Jesus' words are spiritual. Going back to John 3, flesh gives birth to flesh, spirit gives birth to spirit. How do you see or enter the kingdom? You have to be what first? Born again by the Spirit.
Knew their motives. This is just like back in chapter 2 when there was a bunch of followers following him superficially, and he doesn't entrust himself to them. The same context is happening right here. Look at verse 38 now.
Absolutely, Dr. Flowers. It's the exact same context. And why does Jesus not entrust himself at the end of John 2 to the followers? Because he knows what's in a man. And then what happens? We're introduced to a man named Nicodemus who is in spiritual darkness. He's in the same sense. And actually, some of the language is, what if you saw the Son of Man come? Wait, what does it say? What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? Same thing he says to Nicodemus. Right? He's come down from heaven. The connection there is what overcomes what's in a man that makes Jesus not entrust himself to them. What overcomes that? That they hear and learn from the Father first? That they use their libertarian free will in order to receive the teachings that prepares them to receive Christ? No. In John 3, it's very clear. What overcomes that? Jesus not entrusting himself because they see signs? The new birth. Being born again by the Spirit of God. And the wind blows where it wills. We can't capture this work of the Spirit with the libertarian free will of man. That would be as absurd as somebody saying they control the weather with their mind and their will. Now, let's just do one more little thing, and I gotta stop here. But maybe we're halfway through. We might be.
now. For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Notice the unity of the Father and his Son. You see this unity also in chapter 6, verse 39. You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. But the scriptures point to me, Jesus said.
Okay, so Dr. Flowers, I get what you're doing, and I'm not saying what you're doing isn't exegesis, but you just jump out of the verse instantly. So he kind of took Dr. White's thing from the Romans 9 debate and learned from it, but he's still Dr. Flowers. It's more of the way you present it. If you would have just walked through John 6:37 to 45 first, and then presented these other scriptures to back up your points, it just would have came across different. That's all. So we go back to John 5:39. Yes, they are searching the scriptures. And the scriptures point to me. Okay.
Notice he says, if you believe the scriptures, you would believe in Jesus. If you believe what God taught through the prophets, then you would come to Jesus. If you believe what Moses said, you would believe in me because he spoke of me. And once again, we see the exact same pattern. Jesus is rebuking them for their unbelief in verse 40, saying, yet you refuse to come to me to receive life. Now notice the order there. A spiritually dead man
Wait, but we're in John 5 now. It's just confusing. Okay.
Must come to Jesus in order to receive life. Just like in chapter 6, you must eat of the bread in order to live. Whereas Calvinism gets it backwards. You have to be made alive before you can eat. They reverse the order every time. You must understand this repeated pattern. The unbelief of the crowd followed by Jesus rebuking them because of their unbelief.
All right, I'm going to have to stop here. So we got almost halfway through Dr. Flower's presentation. I think we got about nine and a half minutes to go. So hope that was helpful. Just going through it. And we'll continue. I don't want to let this interrupt the other stuff I'm doing. I'm working on 4 views of salvation. I'm working on my Romans verse by verse. So we'll see where this takes us. But thanks for joining us today for this debate review. We'll finish Dr. Flower's opening, and then we'll look at the cross-X next time. All right, thank you, and God bless.